Essentially, we are asking a very simple question in this presentation that was done in cooperation with Azzurra, in cooperation with Tomáš, Talášek, who is currently in Olomouc preparing for his doctoral defense. And the idea is very simple. Can we somehow infer risk attitude from a questionnaire or from a simple observation of a single choice? And yes, I admit that we actually were inspired by the result of one review process which claimed that we cannot even dare to infer risk attitude from a questionnaire. So somehow I would like to discuss the possibilities of this at the end of this presentation. So the key question in the presentation is, can we tell if you are risk neutral? And that risk neutrality might be important in several frameworks, so let's focus on risk neutrality. But otherwise we could ask, can we tell your risk attitude from a questionnaire, from a choice that you make? Okay. Let's see. Can we tell if you are a risk seeker? Well, from some choices we can tell that you are a risk seeker. From several choices, actually. I'm not sure that I need to discuss this more, but essentially I think that from some choices we can infer risk seeking. Can we tell that you're risk averse? Well, there are choices that might be typical for a risk averse decision maker. So essentially, in some cases, we should be able to tell that you are risk averse in a specific setting, in a specific mood, as a specific decision maker. Obviously, there are so many dependencies of your risk attitude that we cannot be sure. Okay, and can we tell if you're risk neutral? What is a risk neutral choice by definition? How can you say, yes, this is a risk neutral choice? And depending on the definition, obviously, of risk attitude. But still, it might be interesting to be able to somehow tell if you are risk neutral. So what do we have? We have experiments. Experiments are rather good to assess risk attitudes, but experiments could be time-consuming, experiments could be costly, and not fitting for all the settings. So let's move to something that is cheaper. Can we tell by observation? Can we tell by questionnaires? By something as simple as asking a question, what would happen if? Because this doesn't cost that much. We can do it online, we can do it on the paper, it is not that difficult to achieve. And essentially, we would like to somehow conclude that yes, we can, to some extent, assess whether your particular answer in a specific setting is of a risk-neutral type, risk-seeking, risk-averse type, somehow. Let's see what the possibilities are, and obviously for this discussion we will need some definitions. I have selected some possible definitions, there are obviously more. But let's say that if we compare a risky alternative with some expected payoff to a sure alternative with the same payoff, then we can say that if the decision maker chooses the risky one, he's risk-seeking. And the logic behind that could be different. We can, for example, assume that there is added value in the risk that you are taking. Risk neutrality then still is rather difficult, and risk aversion, you prefer the sure one. Okay, and risk neutrality is what? If you're risk neutral, you are supposed to be indifferent. How does this indifference manifest itself in the choice? Particularly if you are forced to choose, if you need to come up with, yeah. So essentially, that risk neutrality is very difficult to detect in this setting. And let me see where we ended. Okay, I'm not sure that anyone has ever read that paper, but we have one paper when we constructed a questionnaire, and there were 16 items. All of them were asking for a simple choice between a risky alternative of an expected payoff and its certain equivalent. And somehow, among those 16 choices, you can see the relative frequencies. On the x-axis, we have the respondents. There were 58 respondents in Italy. And you can see with a green color how many risk-averse choices they made, how many risk-seeking choices they made, how many risk-neutral choices. I will get back to that. But let's just focus on the green and the red color. And you can see that obviously what we expect, that there is no pure risk attention or risk attitude. But at the end of the day, we could have identified some risk-averse answers, some risk-seeking answers. And now, I would like to conclude that due to the design that we implemented in the questionnaire, we could claim that the rest was risk-neutral. And let's see if we get there. So, your choices are supposed to be linked somehow with your preferences to some extent in specific settings, unless you choose randomly or unless someone chooses for you or there is some setting that somehow influences the choice. So the question is, how can we fit indifference and incomparability in that framework? Because if we rule out indifference and incomparability, we have pure risk-seeking, risk aversion. And then, if we can identify choices made based on incomparability, we could somehow, or indecisiveness, which somehow fits incomparability and indifference together, if we can identify those choices, we can claim those to be risk neutral to some extent. Let's get back there. Okay, so the usual definition of a preference using that relation that we have there, the classical relation no worse than, could be this one. So you can easily see that if A is not worse than B, and it is not true that B is not worse than A, you can see how difficult it might be to actually ask for something like this. It is not true that A is not worse than, or something. Then you have a clear preference of A. So these definitions, if they can be investigated by a questionnaire, would lead to a clear distinction between risk neutrality, risk seeking, risk aversion. Sort of. But essentially, if you take a look at these definitions, you need two measurements for each. If you want to conclude that A is preferred to B, you essentially have to ask two questions, this one and then this one. And this is not a good setting for a questionnaire to be asking questions repeatedly. I mean, it is a solution, but sometimes it can bias the answers. It can actually bother the respondent so much that he stops answering the questions in several settings. So, can we design a questionnaire that would not require repeated questioning and still allow us to identify the risk attitude? I know that this is well known. I know that you probably assume that if I ask you, do you prefer this alternative or this alternative, choose one, whichever you prefer, then you have actually two choices. You either choose A or you choose B. And the question is, if you choose A, and the A is the risky one, have you made a risk-seeking choice or not? If you choose B and B is the certain one, have you made a risk-averse choice or not? And sometimes we assume that if you select one alternative, that this is actually a selection that you have made consciously, rationally, and that this points to your risk attitude. But obviously this is not necessarily true. It can be true, it cannot be, it might not be true. So essentially if you choose A, it could mean that you prefer A, or it could mean that I have forced you to make a random decision. And if I have forced you to make a random decision, then you are not preferring A, you are probably indifferent, or you could not compare those two alternatives. Okay, I guess that this is clear. I know that we all have encountered something like this in our research. So let's just take a look at some numbers. This is again from the questionnaire that we have administered in Italy, and I have the results from the Czech Republic as well. I guess these are the Czech results. I have the Italian later. And again, we have those 16 questions, and we have essentially used this form of answering, this one. So we have used I prefer A, I prefer B, and we had two more options that started I cannot decide, but if you force me to decide, okay, let's go with A. This sort of setting. And why did we suggested something like that? Well, it was because we wanted to capture the indecisiveness, the difficulties with the decision which point to not a clear preference of A, not a clear preference of B, but instead to some doubts or to some difficulties with getting the answer. And what did we get? Well, we did get that the indecisive answers, those I cannot decide but, were rather frequent. If you can see, these are item by item. So 18% of the answers for item 1 were indecisive, 20, 11%, and so on and so on. So on average, essentially, we had 15% of indecisive answers in each item, on average. And it might seem like a low number, but it is not. And by the way, this is another look at the questionnaires. This tells you how many respondents have used this number of indecisive answers. So we had 3 respondents with 4 indecisive answers out of those 60. So essentially, there were very few respondents that would not be indecisive in any case. Almost every respondent used the indecisive answer at least once. And essentially, to each question that we have asked, there were indecisive answers. So this is not a rare phenomenon to have indecisiveness. It actually is there. And if you take a look at the Italian results, it seems that the Italians are more indecisive than the Czech sample. I know that we cannot generalize. This is a one-time questionnaire, and we had 58 people here, 74 in the Czech Republic. But anyway, if you take a look at this, 26% of the answers to that question were indecisive. But we at least try to capture the indecisiveness in some way, to allow to show the answer. And we are also interested, and this is why the forced choice, even in this indecisive setting, we are interested in whether the first one would be chosen, or if there are people that would say, okay, and if I had to, I would choose the second one, just to have some insight. And I completely agree we could have done it better if we focused on this, or we could have done alternatives to rule out some possible explanation, for sure. And by the way, if we find this interesting, we can proceed with further investigation. But what I wanted to show is that, okay, if you, even in this way, if you capture indecisiveness, and let's stick with the Czech sample where 15% on average were indecisive, well, if you do decision making, you have probably read the papers by Kahneman and Tversky quite many times, and this is one of those that, or one of those settings that were presented in their econometrica paper. And I just wanted to show, let's play what if. What would happen if, in their forced choice setting, we would implement our 15% of indecisiveness, and what if we had such a bad luck that it would really switch to the opposite side, that those indecisive questions would be chosen in the direction that would actually go against the findings. With 15%, instead of 20-65 and 80-35, we could get to 35-50, 65-50. We are getting very close to the significance threshold, because they did not have large samples on these. Yes, those are replications were on large samples, but these were. And by the way, if we went to 22, which is still below the average for Italy, we get 42 compared to 43 and 58 compared to 57. There is no more effect. So essentially, the identification of indecisiveness can be crucial to understand the data that we have there. I know that this is a what-if case and that we are assuming the worst-case scenario anyway, but based on some sort of data that perhaps can be used in this setting. And so in our opinion, it makes sense to try to capture the indecisiveness, to have purer data if you want to. And we suggested this setting And if I am correct, this is important. Going back to the risk attitude. If A was a risky alternative and B was a sure outcome with the same payoff as was the expected payoff, then, and this is the question of the reviewers, and this is the question also of us, and we would like to get the answer to that one. If you, in this setting, if you choose A, you might be considered risk seeker, because you could have expressed your indecisiveness, you haven't, so A could be considered a preference of it. And if A was risky, then you might be a risk seeker. If you choose B, and this was the sure outcome, and you have expressed your preference for B, then you might have been labeled as a risk neutral or as risk averse. And then, can we say that these answers, so not choosing the clear preference of A, not choosing the clear preference of A, can these answers be considered risk neutral? And our working answer to that review, and I'm not sure that we are going to resubmit it to the journal anyway, but our working answer is, well, if we have ruled out risk seeking, if we have ruled out risk aversion, what are we left with? So, in essence, what we would like to infer from this is that these two, whether you force the choice or not, these two can be considered risk neutral, and essentially this sort of setting could allow you, without repeated measurement, by one question, to identify risk attitude of a decision maker by a questionnaire. And I have used up all my time, but in our paper, we have also proposed a mechanism without repeated measurement for the choice between several alternatives, and we propose to use directed graphs to represent preference structures and to represent the preference, indifference, incomparability, and dispreference, all four of them, based on a specific setting of questions by directed graphs. So we have actually went another step further, and we have assumed we have more alternatives, and we propose how to get a graphical representation that could still distinguish between indifference, incomparability, and preference one way or the other. Okay, so this is basically it. Thank you for not leaving the room, and if you have questions, feel free to ask those.